Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Hello. Thanks for joining us. My name is Louisa Ouliette, and I'm curator of talks and events at the Photographers Gallery. We're here this evening with the collective Planetary Portals. The collective comprises of artists Casper Laing Ebbensgaard, Kerry Holden, Marcus Salu and Kaythryn Yusoff. Their work spans social geography, anthropology, and design, and together their research critically examines how various histories intersect with contemporary digital technologies and AI. The outcome of their collective research can be seen in their exhibition, I Am in Your Dreams, But You Are Not Mine, which is currently on show at the Photographers Gallery in London until the 15th of June, and also in our online research and exhibition platform, Unthinking Photography. My colleague will send a link shortly so you can take a look there. This evening's discussion is moderated by writer, researcher, and artist Marcus Gilroy-Ware. He is coordinator at the SOAS Digital Research Center and recently authored After the Fact, The Truth About Fake News, alongside extensive research in linguistics, law, cognitive science, and wider socio-political issues. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We'll be here in total for roughly 60 or so minutes. We'll start off with a presentation by the collective, and then we'll move into a discussion. And throughout the discussion, please feel free to make use of the chat function here to include any questions and comments that you want, or you can pose them at the end of the discussion directly to everyone here. Please remember this is a form of trust and mutual respect, so please keep that in mind with your comments. And now I will ask Michael to share his screen. And thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the evening and the discussion.
Okay. So I hope that's appeared okay. Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'll begin with a kind of short introduction about the Planetary Portals method, and then talk you a little bit through the process of making these works. So the portal is a method that enables us to see imperial imaginings, not as projections over space, but as a radical transformation of socio-material dimensions. The portal engages with material changes of state. For example, the portal opens up when tracing the Rhodes estate in East London that was built by turning clay into bricks, bricks into Victorian slum housing, and the rentier economy that leveraged capital flows into the diamond mines of South Africa, accumulating the immense wealth to enact white supremacist dreams of empire manifest in the mechanized mine and continental infrastructures of rail, telegram, and agriculture. These infrastructures remain and are omnipresent. They form a scaffold or a skeleton of physical, bureaucratic, effective, psychological, and digital infrastructures that make and unmake Africa as the continent for extraction. And of course, photography was an essential tool of imperial communication. The British South Africa Company commissioned photographers to produce large, high-quality volumes of landscape photographs that mirrored the iconography of the American pastoral. Vast, seemingly empty landscapes visualize the frontier, lying passively in wait for settler economies, aimed to incentivize British investors to leverage their capital and expand infrastructural networks of rail, telegraph, and agriculture. These photographs were produced with the intent of making people dream. So colonial photography sets the vernacular for the Western understanding of foreign landscapes and locals as docile material of conquest fantasy. Flora is rendered scenic, pretty, and benign. The natives are simple commodities, comparable to local fauna to be found, controlled, and utilized to deliver the fruits of these lands for a singular extractive idea of progress. When visiting colonial archives and consulting the catalogs of colonial photography, as we've done as a group, it quickly becomes evident that this dream is partial. Whose dreams are omitted? Whose voice is not heard? Who is silenced? whose lives are erased, and what materials cannot be archived? These questions draw attention to how photography was also a space of trespass and refusal, where subjects challenged the present and intent of colonial placemaking. So the films of I Am in Your Dreams, but You Are Not in Mine engage with this controlled fantasy to reinscribe the temporal resistances and dynamism of local people and the natural environment. Appropriate in time as a material of intervention, the films attempt to disrupt the power of the frozen frame. So by filming the photographs, some of which from the similar archives that you saw in the first slide, as the first creative measure of these compositions, we add another temporality to the frame. We're able to then create additional data to work with, both in terms of material for AI experiments and as a timeline for structuring a series of nonlinear film sequences. Within this lies a kind of secret time in which we ask questions about how large language models understand time within the narrow frame of a singular epistemological data set, employing statistical methods that claim objectivity using imagery following on from the landscape painting and the photograph. 2016 is when I first sort of experimented with deep learning GAN models, a precursor to language learning models today. And I quickly noticed an inability to recognize certain bodies, let's say, within the images. Our AI research in this instance focuses on inferences, the hallucinations language learning models render when filling gaps of insufficient training data. Language learning models hallucinate and make assumptions when faced with queries that are missing from the patterns typically present in their training data. From these inferences, we can map to the controlled, exacting syntax of the archive's imperial images. The negative space in this archive shapes how the landscape is perceived and controlled through the photographic gaze. And this is now replicated and entrenched by the syntheses coming from language learning models. So to develop the films that we presented in this exhibition, we thought about trying to invert the language learning model hallucinatory methodology. So where it forces a kind of output, a definitive answer from spaces in where the data doesn't match up, we implement an interactive dialogue to coax out the machine's knowledge gaps, directing the temporal resistances in and around the film photographs. We intervene in ground truths with our custom human-written inferences, developed as text, soundscapes, and resistant images, which interrogate the hallucinatory inferences of these models. Our interventions symbolize resisting automation and disrupting renderings of spatial and temporal patterns that sustain the current planetary condition. Our development method involves several overlapping sort of back and forth processes between analog and digital, 2D and 3D, code and tools, image and text. So to ensure a kind of coherent pieces within this exhibition and to render our concept clearly, we set some constraints for the process. Number one shot of the photographic frame. Number two, using the immediate generative outputs that we get from language learning models through a combination of our use of photography and the inputs, the text that we choose to write. Number three, intuitive nonlinear edits and repetition as a mode of being, repetition as something kind of incantatory, something ritualistic, and something resistant. And then the wilder sort of variable that comes in as number four, it's a series of animations, both human and inhuman, which the intention is to sort of disrupt or to imply that we need manual human intervention to disrupt a lot of the automated processes. So slide 5 here, I think it's just an introduction to the conceptual framing around these films. They are all single shot, and what I mean by that is that the camera doesn't move. what we're doing is concentrating on the photograph. We're concentrating on that archive. To conceptually frame this, we utilize the proscenium, which is referred to, as you see in that quote there, by Aimé Césaire. One, as a kind of response to this idea of the native in the photograph being a kind of, let's say, a figure lacking agency. And two, using the proscenium as a way of actually extending the narrative within a fixed frame. So the proscenium being this space on a stage which exists in front of the curtain and between the audience. It's somewhat liminal, but we can fill that space with kind of drama and narrative. So by unthinking the medium of both the photograph and the moving image as colonial by design, as they've been established anyway, and therefore invisible to most of us, in the context of visual legacies that are embedded within data sets, it's essential for us to present a methodology for engaging with this work. So the photograph becomes a kind of set, and the film footage as the first scene. And photography served as a powerful imperial technology, where settlers commissioned albums to capture vast, seemingly empty landscapes, as we said. But nothing is really as it seems. So whilst the photographs are often showing sort of white subjects in a triumphalist mood, they also create a shadow of those silenced by white supremacy, as you might see just with sort of illuminating a little bit within this photographic frame here. And then from that, the next step to this project is to develop a series of short scripts. So these are narratives that we've done as a group, developed around each photograph. And continuing our sort of methods of giving voice to archival absences, inconsistencies, and muted or whitewashed violence, these scripts are the kind of raw material for textual translation, animations, and provocations for the language learning models. And these texts appear at the bottom of the films, and they write into the negative space of the image. And combined with sections of archival photographs, this text is fed into several language learning large learning models. And we wrote these texts without the sort of suggested corrective language that is sort of implied to get the best outputs from these models, intentionally wanting the language learning models to spit out very immediate assumptions. So no obfuscation through this process of kind of perfecting. And then we then present these unedited assumptions back into the photograph. The text as seen in the films and by the machine holds a kind of conflict. It erases and it repairs. So the text in the film serves as both a kind of reparative guide to the colonial photography, but also as a source material. And it points out the sort of racist and patriarchal assumptions that are made through the data sets, through this accumulative visual legacy. And the archive photograph combines with our text. It becomes a kind of puzzle that the language learning model is trying to solve pattern recognition. But there aren't any kind of safe or familiar patterns to lean on. And this exposes how its solutions are often founded in these historical kind of racial logics of subjugation and erasure. And this scene here is a good example. So what we're trying to do, the text is actually trying to speak to one of the particular characters in the photograph, but that character, a Black woman, is immediately erased by this figure that comes to the fore as a white woman hierarchically, who's then erased by a white man. But sort of developing these, I'm sort of quite interested in creative editing, like intuitive editing. So we treat these images, these compositions, as we've gathered all this data, we treat them like painting. So they're painted, these outputs are painted into the composition, structured in a non-linear sort of ways, just in a sense, so in a way so you can get the feeling of the process and finding us a way of presenting very clearly that we need to kind of consider the way that we view images, particularly film. So layered across these films are animations, which foreground the sensory poetics of landscapes, weather, and bodily movements. They're an attempt to kind of symbolically restore these erasures, these reminders of life, both human and inhuman. And resistance here becomes something living: idleness, curiosity, emotion, the dances of various communities that have been shoved indiscriminately into labor camps, or the dance of flora on a breeze. So these agender animations are intended to evoke the kind of continued work necessary to bring light to the kind of symbiotic relationship between Africa and the West, both domestically and in the diffused kind of liminality of diaspora. So what manual work is necessary to be seen and heard through the glare of an automated worldview exacerbated by something like artificial intelligence? So working with a variety of 3D software, game engine software, we make use of a kind of virtual 3D space, superimposing this dimension onto the photographs, which is a kind of another synthesis of time and space to create the imagery, animations, shadow, light. And this motion capture enables us to translate human acts of resistance. And this use of technology is sort of intentional and considered to be, from our point of view, more of an intervention. And to conclude, one of my colleagues can help me discuss a little bit what we've done to structure the rest of the work around these films. Does anyone like to step forward? Just a sort of little brief introduction to our audience of just about how we've structured the languages around this space.
Hi. So if you, in the exhibition space, and thanks, Michael, that's brilliant kind of overview of the project. And in the exhibition space, we had this idea to stack African languages running along the lower part of the wall. And I forget the actual number, I think it's around over 2,000, and mainly to demonstrate the kind of singularity of AI as a language, as a way of encoding the world and interpreting it and feeding back into it. And we have a Bible, a Shona Bible on display, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. And it's just as you come out of the lift, I think, the Shona Bible's there, and that's sort of also to demonstrate the Bible was the key sort of document of translation. Anyway, so in order to sort of translate African languages into an AI language, or a computing language, sorry, the Bible is often used as one of the key texts because it's historically one of the key texts in which translation happened. So it becomes a kind of key reference in a way. And we thought that was quite interesting, of course, because the Bible was the sign of the spread of Christianity during colonialism and with missionary work and education, etc. So we thought it's kind of interesting as well to think about how this gets repeated and reenacted through modern day computing. So I hope that kind of gives us sort of insight into the use of the languages. And if anyone else wants to say anything more.
I mean, I think just to say that there were 5 languages that were picked out in red, which are the languages that are kind of form the basis of African large language models. So you've got amongst this cacophony of languages, both living and those that are kind of read as kind of dead. Only 5 languages are being used in language learning models. So this isn't a kind of a process of sort of racial exclusion or deficit, but actually a kind of, very much part of the foundational organizations of what we were thinking about in terms of the AI archive and what the AI archive is as a kind of epistemic and aesthetic space.
Well, thank you. to all of you actually for this amazing work, and especially for your comments, and Michael for your presentation on this. I've been really excited to talk to you all about this. I have a lot of questions for you, and I would like to also hear questions from our audience on here. So I may not get through all of them, but it would be great to kind of drill down into some of the hopefully not in too abstract of a register, but to some of the kind of theories and ideas that this work, I think, speaks to. Yes, as Louisa has said, please do put any comments in the chat as they come up, and when we get to the Q&A, I will look and see what we have. So the hardest part in a way is to know where to start, really. That you've so kind of interestingly connected together themes around, contemporary technologies and their provenance and the forms of power that lead to that kind of generation of those technologies, and the unanswered questions that remain there around our relationship to those technologies. And then, of course, historical technologies like photography that sort of have underpinned that, I guess, colonial way of thinking and looking at the world. Castro Gomez calls it the hubris of the 0 point. So to bring those things together, I just think is fascinating. If it's not too big of a question to start with, I'm wondering how you see these kinds of correspondences between different forms of power, particularly how the forms of power embodied in colonial South Africa and colonialism generally, how those, I suppose, correspond with and overlap with the types of power that we're seeing now in digital technologies and platforms. Of course, there's minerals and those kinds of things. There's questions of ideology and discourse, and then, of course, there's the issue of the human herself. So perhaps would one of you like to kind of take that one? I appreciate it's a big one, but I'd love to hear that's what the first thing I thought of when I saw the work.
I mean, I would be inclined to maybe defer, because I think maybe it's a good idea to actually just sort of introduce, the Portal project in a way, because that would help explain.
Actually, yeah, please do. Why not? That's a great idea.
The answer as such. So I don't know if you guys want to maybe jump in there.
Maybe Casper has the most kind of efficient, I think, explanation of what we're doing, which sometimes expands and contracts.
I don't know, but on the note of power, I guess one thing is the link, of course, to annotators and labelers, that whole way of thinking about labor. So that's one area that maybe someone else will want to talk about. But one thing that immediately comes to mind in the way that we're working with these images is that sort of subliminal power of the subjugated, of the wretched, the ones that aren't allowed to, I guess, feature in a sort of full version. So the woman in flux that is not captured, but that is a mode of refusal. The man that sits in the foreground with the train running behind, the train tracks running behind, who is, forced to sit there and play prop in a particular way of viewing landscape, in a particular way of performing landscape, or performing a certain sort of subjugated person in landscape. That particular way that the images instruct ways of seeing, and therefore subjugating certain people to a sort of position without power, where they aren't allowed a full life. What we're trying to do with these images is I guess, intervene into and think with, if we were to think about a full life to take place in those spaces, then what kind of work would need to be done to kind of like unmake that way of seeing? So sort of instructing a new way of seeing, or allowing us to see what we actually aren't allowed to see. And I guess that's sort of back to that whole language stack across the room that it sort of visually makes it apparent all of the languages that AI isn't speaking, and therefore all the cultures that aren't allowed to speak through AI or aren't listened to, that it's not learning from. And with that, of course, is the whole sort of cultural richness, rituals and ways of thinking, ways of performing that aren't allowed to speak or aren't listened to. So in that sense, I think like the power dynamic, what we're trying to do is on the one hand expose the way that AI is continuing this reduction of a land and sort of diverse peoples to something homogeneous, and trying to open up ways of allowing for a different way of interacting and engaging with that space. So that's one way of thinking about higher power dynamics, I guess, in this work.
Anyone want to add anything from Planetary Portals before?
I mean, just about that, we are obviously in a kind of a time of rebound of white supremacy, and probably that comes together most sort of archetypally in someone like Musk, for example, and as both a product of that South African landscape, but also someone who's very actively reshaping those landscapes, both in terms of kind of epistemologies and what we've seen recently, the whole kind of white genocide narrative, alongside actually setting up data centers and kind of putting in infrastructures in. So I think what we were trying to think about is how the photographs and the woman in flux, for example, like she's already taking her own freedom in her hands. She's already challenging power in this kind of epistemic rebound, in refusing to look at the camera, claiming this kind of a temporality that is not standing in place, is not being a kind of, as Casper said, a prop to a sort of imperial narrative making. So I think it's thinking about kind of what kind of power dynamics are already happening in this kind of space, and and how do these continue in the kind of the kind of claustrophobia of the new kind of spaces of AI and computation that are kind of again re-engaging very heavily with kind of extraction and kind of questions of extraction, but extraction specifically kind of as it is kind of modified by white supremacy. And I think that's kind of a very deadly power combination then and now, if that isn't too much for...
No.
Anyone else?
I was going to say also that this project is speaking to the ways in which the humanist model has this within its kind of epistemology, as Kaythryn was saying, has this illusory sort of quality to it, and that we could see that with the photographs in the archives, this like selling a dream. And you can map that whilst the material itself is being extracted and value and wealth is being applied to that. And then you can bring that to the modern day through the way in which we use visual culture now, through this process of obfuscation, particularly now you're seeing with generative AI, whilst in the background, we talked about annotative labor, and we talked about, social media screeners for violent content and the kind of cognitive labor that's being done there. So that's all happening at the same time. So that is also a very kind of illusory sort of process, and it centers around a very particular idea of the human that doesn't include everyone.
I think
Actually, oh, go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry.
I just to answer your question, like to link, the contemporary sort of age of computing and colonial photography. I'm just going to share my screen because it's a very practical demonstration is provided by Google, which the guys know. Let me see. Can you see it okay?
Yeah,
we can see it.
So here you've got this is the British South Africa company that was spearheaded by Rhodes on the left. And you can see the red line of infrastructure climbing the continent. And a very interesting quote from Rhodes, and the crest and coat of arms, etc. And I mean, this is a particular kind of narrative about connecting the continent lying in shadow constantly. And it's kind of re-articulated. You can see here, this is Google Africa, latest fiber optic pipeline to connect the continent to Australia. And you can see that it's drawn in Maasai beading, and it's named Umoja, which in Swahili means unity. So these kind of discourses around what the continent is like and how the continent should be continue to be recapitulated. And again, as you know, as Michael just said, they disguise the environmental and human material costs of actually building this infrastructure and operating it and sustaining it. So that all gets disguised behind a sort of techno-utopianist kind of discourse. And then here, interestingly, you've got the previous fiber optic pipeline connecting Africa. This is there's several pipelines, of course. I mean, if you can generate a map of the pipelines coming into Africa. These are prominent ones that are privately owned by Google. And you can see it's called Equiano, and it links Portugal to the west coast of Africa. So it's kind of they use the name of someone who led the abolition movement from the UK and was a freed former enslaved person. And the pipeline follows the North Atlantic slave trade route around the coast of Africa, probably because the infrastructure is there to support that building as well. So this is kind of like just to sort of address your question, and I'll stop sharing, around kind of how we build the connections between sort of this era of extraction and aggressive extraction in Southern Africa and contemporary configuration of computing and AI. So
thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, I have a one little follow-up for you all. In my work, I certainly hear people using the word colonialism as a metaphor to talk about the way that big tech, deals with the global South. And I'm never entirely sure whether I'm comfortable with that, because I think the sort of enduring violence and brutality of colonialism is something that's kind of quite hard to metaphorize and then use in such a different context. I'm wondering what you all think about that, whether you think that's an appropriate way to think about what big tech is doing now in terms of global inequality and its sort of exploitation of that. Is this a fruitful metaphor that we can use, or should we find other ways?
I mean, I think kind of immediately metaphor sort of puts it into a realm that is kind of not material. So I think one of the things that we've been doing is really thinking about the sort of the geologic terms of these, of these forms of colonialism. What does all the new siting of data centers in South Africa, use a tremendous amount of water. South Africa is currently sort of, experiencing, huge water shortages. So they actually just thinking about these not as kind of metaphors, but as a kind of geophysics, I think helps actually see what is colonialism and what isn't, in a sense, to make that kind of differentiation. And so that everything doesn't become colonialism, which makes it difficult to really kind of be specific sort of geographically about what's going on.
Sure, I suppose maybe analogy is a better word than metaphor. Is it an analogy, or is it a continuation, or is it something else? Thank you.
One of the things that we've been trying to think about with the portal is just to kind of how to articulate these connections. So how do we take a sort of set of connections that sustain kind of these infrastructures of extraction, but also kind of narrativizations across time and space. And so the portal was a way of trying to understand these kind of spatialities and these kind of recurrences, that it doesn't sort of map onto other kinds of, geographies of networks or kind of geopolitics and so on. So the portal is a kind of way to think about what keeps sort of a colonial continuum open, in a sense, like what sustains it, what kind of forms of extraction are needed to keep the portal open. So, part of our kind of remit has been about how to shred the portal. It's quite simply
How to
shred the portal. Like, how to both recognize other portals, like that Woman in Flux is making herself, but also kind of how to sort of shred these colonial continuums.
Thank you. So I suppose staying within a kind of similar vein, one of the things I also wanted to kind of ask you about in this work is, so at the moment, I suppose this course, particularly recently, has been one in which, notions of truth and reality, obviously already very rightly critiqued, have been particularly contested. And I suppose there's a sort of general version of a question here, and also a photography-specific one. At one point, you speak of the violent yet sanitized and synthesized reality of British imperialism as historical fact that is reproduced through LLMs. And so I suppose I'm wanting to ask you about, the contestation of truth as you see it, both historically and as a sort of contemporary social process in this, and how your work speaks to those challenges generally. But also, photography in particular has a history of, in its early days, having been reified as a sort of medium of universal truth. And yet there's something in these images which is kind of really seems to be trying to very much be conspicuous about the fact that photography and photographic looking images cannot be and should not be taken in that spirit. And so, and obviously bringing the kind of hallucinations of AI and this kind of, Michael, I think you said illusory or dreamlike, or used a phrase like that. This kind of element into the images, I think, is really powerful. And I wonder, again, I'd like to hear more about your kind of intentions as a group around how you think critically about the sort of truth value of images. So I guess there's two questions there. One is truth in general as a historical construction. One is about truth in images.
Who would like to open? I mean, certainly when I'm thinking about truth in terms of images, I can only think essentially about power, so those with the agency, whether that's, through wealth, whether that's through just control of the frame, get to tell the narrative. So if you look at the sort of, as you're saying, look at the history of photography, even if you look at sort of the second half of the 20th century and typical documentary reportage photography that, comes through newspapers, magazines, commissions, etc., where, well-educated photographers studying at one of the best schools of London will then be sort of sent around to far-flung parts of the world to essentially give us a report through that image about what's kind of been going on. And the only way to sort of really think about that is address that through this kind of process of power and also soft power. So what work are the photographers doing for the media organizations? What work are the media organizations then doing for geopolitical kind of jousting? And I think it's quite important to sort of almost like step in and break down and think about those hierarchies. And then as that moves into kind of digital technology, then we can think about algorithms and so on in the same way. So what work are algorithms doing as a very quiet, soft, illusory kind of soft power to shape the ways in which we see and who we see and how? And I'm very interested in that kind of process because they get more and more sophisticated. Like data analysts are able to kind of develop now algorithmic systems that can just keep intuiting, and it's the intuition is a form of soft power, and then until it becomes hard power.
I think it's also important to point out the significance of photography in South Africa. And throughout the 20th century, colonial photography used to generate a sort of settler society, to imagine it, to attract. I mean, those photographs in those big volumes where they were likely shown is in offices back in London, you know, so the bureaucratic spaces, or, you know, they were shown to attract investment and, you know, to kind of inspire migration to this space. So they constructed an imaginary, or they aided the construction of imaginary, and then you get into the post sort of 1950s and the emergence of the apartheid state, and photography becomes a real tool of resistance in showing you the truth of what is actually happening to the world. So I think it's important to, I don't know, the truth is, it's a complicated, complex question, isn't it? Because of course the whole of Africa throughout colonialism was an experimental laboratory, if you like, for the field sciences. So it was a site of truth making in terms of, you know, botany, anthropology, geography. All the field scientists experimented in the continent, kind of, and produced a kind of truth that we regularly, I mean, we refer to that. We might kind of not, we might resist the grounds upon which that knowledge was made, but it is in the canon of major discipline. So so I don't know, like, I think it's quite complicated, but I think the sort of the use of photography is interesting in relation to the history and the making and the forging of the South African state. And it becomes vitally important to resistance and refusal as you progress through the 20th century, with photographers like Ernest Cole and Morpho King trying to expose what was really happening in that country, because the politics of it was very sort of opaque in that, and in actually revealing what was happening. So yeah, I don't know, the uses are quite interesting.
I think it's kind of, I mean, just building on what Kerry was saying, I mean, the last two prizes at the Photographers Gallery have been won by South African photographers the last 2 years. And, you know, I mean, it is one of the most kind of vibrant spaces of the photography currently. And I think that, you know, both of those kind of winning, what is it, is it the Borsch Prize or the Dutch? I can't remember but both of those kind of, you know, there's an engagement and the troubling of the documentary image, and I think that that sort of double valence of both kind of a recognition of a space of truth telling, but also kind of speculative interventions into that kind of narrativization has really been important.
And maybe like one thing to add then is that back to the work is that it tries to engage with speculative fiction as a way of reinterpreting and I guess inviting us to see what we're not allowed to see in colonial photographs. So like Kerry said, is this very systematic and almost claim to a neutral representation of what the land is like, what the land looks like, these rolling hills and mine landscapes and technologies, British infrastructure, all of this is what it's recording in one-to-one. But it's not allowing us to see lots of things, and therefore that sort of engagement with speculative fiction is I guess a way of trying to open up for other ways of seeing what it doesn't record. But yeah, it's an interesting way of framing truth. I hadn't thought of the work in that frame before.
I guess it goes to show that when you make art, there are just so many different kind of interpretations of it. there's a very clear, though, kind of insurgent troubling, I think, of the photographic image, and that comes across really strongly. I have one more question for you, and then we'll open it up to the other questions we might get from the audience, if that's all right. So actually, this is in some ways more of a technical question, but also, again, one that's kind of deliberative and theoretical, hopefully. But as Michael pointed out at the beginning in the presentation, there's quite a lot of using AI to kind of to do as a stage in the image production. And I'm curious, given the critiques that I know we all have of technology and of AI and of generative AI and its capacity to distort, what your kind of thinking was around how you selected those tools, and whether your thinking was that, as Audre Lorde put it, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, or whether in fact you could sort of perhaps detour those AI tools towards challenging the very forms of power that they both are depicting and representing. What are your what are your views on that?
I mean, certainly the sort of, like I said, I've sort of been thinking about or paying attention to those gaps for some years. So looking at really early basic kind of machine learning models or image generation models, and those sort of like absences were already apparent. And it was really like a kind of process of like how I want to introduce a way in which it's really about a gaze, like a way of like kind of structuring a gaze. And if we didn't do this, then maybe that's sort of my only answer in a sense. Like if we don't do it, then who will? Because it's very unlikely that this kind of critique can happen through the process of using these kind of tools. Most people are sort of running with it and going, okay, not really thinking about it. And you might argue, some might argue with us and say, well, why are you actually engaging with those tools? And I think it's more about like, it's actually important for people like us to engage consciously and critically with these technologies and this kind of material. And I think this project, in my opinion, isn't really about AI. It's about that long, as I said, it's about that long history of images that's accumulated, that which are now being taken by big tech, and you were saying that maybe we want to think about using the word colonialism, but there's, those sort of legacies are very apparent because this is another tier of extraction, isn't it? So it's pointed in the direction of, say, Africa and the global south, and now it's pointed at us. But it's another process of extraction. And I think it's quite important for us to kind of have these moments of pause where we can address what we're looking at. And I think if we had did this project 30 years ago, we might have been thinking about television and film, but it would be the exact same kind of critique, I think, just an evolution of that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We have a couple of questions in the chat already. First one from B. Denton is it appropriate to refer to AI as an archive?
I mean, I think this was a question for us. It's like, is it an archive? What kind of archiving practices does it have? If we think about it as an archive in the same way we think about the colonial archive as an archive, like, how do we begin to think about the forms of sort of editing and kind of omission and extraction that exist in that kind of formation of power? So I think kind of, what Michael was just talking about in this sort of dismemberment of the gaze, in the Woman of Flux, you see very clearly how, when the narrative text is trying to repair her space and her kind of presence in that photograph, what it actually does is replace her by a white woman and then a white man. And this is not, it sort of dispels very quickly, and it's kind of a really chilling moment where you see, that isn't racial bias. That is like you know, that it's a form of replacement, it's a form of settler kind of, and that, you know, that comes from, you know, what constitutes the archive. And, you know, and that's why with the sort of stacking of languages, we very much wanted it to sort of read like a kind of language stack, like an archive, so that actually the sort of concept of an AI archive, which is not sort of a thing that we think about necessarily, becomes a way of imagining, you know, what is missing from that archive, but also what the kind of violent forms of replacement within that archive are, and the kind of its forms of editing and its forms of annotation and so on. So really that's, I think, a kind of provocation for us to say, you know, what is the AI archive? How does it function? And what kinds of response and responsibility does it kind of map into how we think about AI and its kind of, and what it can do?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a provocation, right? And I think anyone who's spent time in a colonial archive will know how, in a sense, stultifying it is, but that it's such a limited vision that you have on the world. It's a limited portrayal of the world. And we don't necessarily think of AI in a similar way, being a very sort of limited perspective on the world. So I guess putting the two together is a provocation to think about the silences of AI, that it is not a truthful representation, that it is an interpretation that is guided by a particular worldview, particular vision, or particular understanding.
Yeah, and to expand on what Casper's saying, that archive is for the most part the internet, which is obviously, you know, flawed in terms of its own knowledge and data acquisition. So even if you look at, I don't know, the canon of, let's say, literature published in, let's say, use, you know, Britain and America, you know, over the last 100 years, and that's going to be the dominant form of literature that we're going to pull from within the AI archive. That says very little about the human condition more broadly. So I think it's an archive. It's a narrow archive in that sense.
Yes, I suppose there remains the question of, like, according to whose logics the archive is organized, and how, you know, given the sort of black box nature of AI and its training, it's much harder to sort of discern what those are.
I think there's also worth, on the other side, like creating an archive, if you like, of the sort of technologies of the imagination around AI, like the maps that I showed you. I mean, they project a particular kind of dominant ideology about AI and the discourses that surround it. And I do think it's worth sort of, you know, collecting these kinds of, I mean, they're basically publicity materials or promotional or brochures, etc. Because they structure the material realities, and they do a lot of work to, like we said before, to disguise the material realities of the environmental and human costs that are at stake. They're all about they're all forward facing as well. They're all about what is going to happen, and in techno-liberal terms, of course. So I think, like, yeah, on the other side, actually generating a kind of record and index of how AI is imagined is quite interesting. So
that would be fascinating. I hope somebody is doing that. But we have another question. Kerry, I'm glad that you're doing that. I'd like to see that in that case. So Cecile says, the names written on the wall are also giving some indications to follow this speculative fiction, ? Can you tell us more about these localizations? Who wants to take this one?
does she read the languages?
I'm not entirely sure. That's what the question says. Cecile, perhaps you could clarify for us. Well, I mean, yeah, Cecile's pointed out that she saw the installation, but does not know the names.
So that's just what's around the wall is just a kind of a list of African languages. So
Right.
and then the ones with the kind of strike through are ones that are recognized as dead languages. So it's just from a, kind of data set of African languages of current and present, spoken and written languages.
Yeah, and that's also, thinking beyond, the European division of Africa into those nation states that everybody recognizes. These are thousands of languages that have existed, through that and beyond in much more kind of fluid and smaller formations.
While we wait for the next question, I'm curious, do you think that there are ways, because it's so us, we're having a lot of conversations about AI and cultural competency and linguistic competency, and some of the ideas that have been suggested, to me also verge into a kind of almost colonial mindset of their own, if I can say that, in the sense that, okay, well, London's a great city, we've got lots of this kind of history here, let's use it to kind of make AI projects that have that cultural competency. Do you think there are ways that we can kind of, to the extent that AI is here and it's not going to go anywhere, and so making it somehow more kind of culturally competent is probably a good idea? There are ways that we can do that without sort of reproducing these patterns that are analogous to colonial power relations.
I think I was at a conference the other day actually, and around the materialities of AI, and I think that this almost default position and the default way of talking is very technologically determinist, that it's coming at us. It has its own autonomy from society. It evolves according to its own internal logics. Whereas I think there's been at least, 50 years of social construction of technology. And I think some fluency in philosophies of knowledge and critical approaches to technology is a good thing, to kind of think that we do actually shape it. And it's a political discourse, of course, because it really means that our thinking around AI defers power to a handful of companies around the world and processes, and whereas actually being able to think about it as a social technology would be perhaps a lot more fair, potentially, and just. So I think the way institutions approach it, like universities, it's quite striking actually that they are talking in a very determinist language about AI rather than tapping into the expertise that they have across humanities and social sciences to actually think more differently about it. So yeah, I'd like to see more of that more critical discourse around it. And yeah.
Me too. We have one more question, which I will do my best to kind of to interpret. The more we use AI, the more we feed the database and consume energy, but we can cast question, says this question. Is it deconstruction of supremacy or reproduction of it to use AI? But I suppose in some sense we've touched on this already, but I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add around kind of the various uses of it, and whether there is a way to kind of use it in a sort of insurgent way that resists its logics.
I mean, I think there's always insurgency, but I think it does come back to this question that Casper just kind of brought up about who gets to imagine the world, and like fewer and fewer people, kind of, in terms of our current sort of, organizations of tech are getting to imagine the world, and that's that has a very distinct impact on democracy, right, on kind of forms of participation, but also the ways in which you're rendered passive through, it's like, even a Google search now, and you get the AI version, you're already being suggested a particular kind of response. So your responses, you know, being pre-organized, that you know, and then you become the annotate, you know, you kind of annotate that to give a kind of preferred answer. But it creates a very different sort of relationship, like even with text, in terms of being a sort of reader and a user. So I mean, there's always insurgency, but I think there's a kind of a particular, as Kerry was saying, a sort of amnesia about the power dynamics of AI at the moment, and also like that everything computational is kind of now being rebranded as AI, when, you know, kind of there's this sort of, you know, forgetting of the kind of histories of computation and also the critiques that have run alongside them.
Well, thank you all. I'd like to thank Michael, Kerry, Kaythryn, and Casper, and the Planetary Portals Collective for this fantastic work, which is still on show at the Photographers Gallery for another 10 days until June 15th. Please take time to go and see it. I'm certainly going to do it before that closes, in terms of the real physical version. It's been really, really interesting to hear you all talk about the work, and I think it's fantastic. Yeah, thank you for asking me to speak to you all about this.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
yeah, it's a real pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And thank you to the Photographers Gallery.
Yes.
Indeed.
Quite.
Yes. Thank you, Louisa. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Aria. I don't know if he's there. But...
Lurking around in the background. I've just posted a link to a symposium that we're having at the beginning of next month called Material Memory and the AI Archive. Planetary Portals will be with us, along with our forthcoming exhibiting artist, Felicity Hammond, and we'll be looking at related themes. So I've sent the link and I'll circulate it over email, but thank you everyone for your contributions tonight. Thank you, Michael, Kerry, Kaythryn, Marcus, and Casper, and Sam, of course, my colleague. Enjoy the rest of your evening or day wherever you are, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank
You
you.
too. Take care. Bye.
Bye bye.